Welcome. Thank you for watching this Bible teaching from Island Community Church in downtown Memphis, Tennessee. We hope today's message will help you grow in relationship with Jesus. You can access more gospel resources and ways to connect with our church at iccmemphis.com or by downloading our Island Community Church app. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, if you've got a Bible, join me in Ecclesiastes. That's where I understand the groups have been. We'll get to the text momentarily. I've been asked to address the topic tonight of how to live wisely in a complex age, how wisdom, God's wisdom, specific to the Lord, shapes our daily lives. And we're going to utilize Ecclesiastes as something of a grounding text. And I think the first thing that I want to say, just right off the bat, we just jump right off the high dive into the pool here, is that the complexity is not just in our age, it's also in our wisdom. Biblical wisdom respects complexity. Now, I learned that some years ago in the book of Proverbs, which is a stop just before Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. I'd often heard Proverbs presented as, okay, the Proverbs, let's not get carried away, they're not promises, they're principles. And I always found that dissatisfying. It made the reader sort of the judge of whether this proverb fit my experience or not, based on whether it worked or not. And I think a better way to read Proverbs will distinguish between what's complicated and what's complex. That basically what the Proverbs say to us is, hey, life isn't complicated. If you make foolish decisions, you'll typically find yourself in consequences and circumstances you don't want. So the Proverbs are often saying, life isn't complicated. Don't do stupid stuff. That's kind of how the Proverbs operate. Isn't difficult to understand. But the Proverbs also say, life is complex. It has layers. There are layers within circumstances and layers within consequences. As an example of wisdom complexity, I asked you to go to Ecclesiastes, and I want you to turn a couple pages back to Proverbs, just to give you an example of this, a flavor of this, before we get to Ecclesiastes. Proverbs 26. Verses 4 and 5. Here's wisdom in all of its beautiful complexity. Proverbs 26, verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Proverbs 26, 5, the very next verse. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Okay, which one is it? Well, these proverbs are put intentionally back to back to indicate complexity. There are circumstances where I let a fool fail. The Proverbs give us different kinds of fools. Some of it depends on what kind of fool you're dealing with. There are other circumstances where I should intervene. Like if the fool in question is 15 and I'm raising him and trying to get him through high school. Okay? I have one of those back in Nashville. But biblical wisdom, it's cagey like this in places. And nowhere is it cagier than Ecclesiastes. In Proverbs, you see wisdom's complexity. But in Ecclesiastes, we see wisdom's paradox, including things like the preacher of Ecclesiastes, whether it was Solomon or someone using Solomon's persona. It's an open question in scholarship. There's arguments both ways. I just keep calling him the preacher. That's what he called himself. One of the paradoxical things you gain from Ecclesiastes is that the wise know themselves to actually be fools. That's a paradox. But that's something the preacher, as he calls himself in Ecclesiastes, when chapter 2 unfolds, and he says he tested himself with pleasures of all kinds, the paradox of wisdom is that the wise know we can be fools. Just like every humble person I've ever known will tell you that they're actually proud and that they've learned humility through usually difficult circumstances. And it's a practice. So as we wade into this subject tonight, living wisely in a complex age, I think it's good to begin with the acknowledgement that the complexity is not just in our age, it's also in our wisdom. Exhibit A from Ecclesiastes. Now that you're in Ecclesiastes, look over at chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, the last verse in chapter 1, which is verse 18, that says, "For in much wisdom is much vexation." I'm reading from the English Standard Version tonight. "And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." And you go, what does that mean? Wisdom that hurts? That's a thing? You know, a lot of us, we so badly want to feel like we're in control of our lives and our circumstances. I'm not saying everyone is a control freak, but we like control. We like feeling like we're in control. We like planning our steps and expecting the things that we invest in to go a certain way. And we'll even think that gaining wisdom gives us more control. But the preacher says, all through his pages here, no. You can't control death, for instance. He has a lot to say about death. You can't even control much of your life. And this is what makes us sorrowful. That's why it says that there is, when I actually preached Ecclesiastes recently in my church in Nashville, which is a very similar church to yours. So I'm actually now used to looking out at young faces, and I love this. I love where God's put us in Nashville with a young congregation. And when I preached on 118 a couple months ago, the sermon was called "Get the Wisdom That Hurts." And what we meant by the wisdom that hurts is the wisdom that kills our illusion of control and our sense that I've got to be in control. Bono, in an interview some 20 years ago, I'm actually reading his new biography right now called Surrender. It's fantastic. I tried to get tickets. Nashville was one of his cities. He came on his book tour, but within 3 minutes, the ticket thing sold out for the Ryman, so I was out in the cold. But about 20 years ago, he did an interview, and he said this about Ecclesiastes, Bono's words. Quote, "It's a book about a character who wants to find out why he's alive, why he was created. He tries knowledge, he tries wealth, he tries experience, he tries everything. You hurry to the end of the book to find out why, and it says, 'Remember your Creator.' In a way, it's such a letdown, yet it isn't." End quote. Why not? Why is Ecclesiastes kind of a letdown, and yet it isn't? Because among the things the preacher wants us to understand, all the things that he explores, he wants us to understand how we make an idol of everything, even including wisdom, and pursue wisdom under the illusion that if we have it, we can control all the outcomes. If we have wisdom, we can even insulate ourselves from suffering. He says we cannot. Wisdom gives us skills for navigating complexity, a complex age. Wisdom will help you manage your life. Wisdom will help you manage your money and your relationships. Wisdom will help you avoid common pitfalls that others have fallen into. Wisdom will help you avoid extremes. There's a verse in the NIV rendering of Ecclesiastes chapter 7 that says the wise will avoid all extremes. But it won't give you full control of your life and living. Wisdom gives life added value. There's another part of Ecclesiastes, I think it's chapter 8, verse 1, that says wisdom makes the face shine. So wisdom gives us this value. But then 118 says it also gives us this added weight. Now, Barrett asked me to proceed tonight, keeping a couple of questions in mind. One of his questions, he gave me two. What does it mean to live winsomely with God's wisdom in our post-truth infotainment culture? Is infotainment a Barrett word? I like that word. I'm going to use that word. How do we live winsomely with God's wisdom? Sometime when you have some free time, go to the Christianity Today archives and go back and look for an article written by Tish Harrison Warren. Great writer. She used to be on the Vanderbilt campus, which is just down the street from my church. And she was with InterVarsity a college ministry, and they got kicked off. Vanderbilt, 10 or so years ago, kicked a lot of the evangelical ministries off campus, or just severely limited their freedom. And I think that's been resolved since then. But she said that the shock of her life to that point was that she thought they had such an intellectually winsome ministry, and that a place like Vanderbilt would appreciate that, but that the offense of the gospel was still an offense. Winsomeness is no guarantee that God's wisdom will get a hearing. I mean, I like it better than the alternative, surliness, or, Christians being cranks. I don't like that. But what winsomeness does, just to kind of bring it down to its essence, wisdom makes you accessible to people as you find them, not as you would make them. Again, we're kind of dealing with the control factor again. Nor is winsomeness the absence of courage, as if winsomeness means we will never tell people what they don't want to hear. There's been a little Twitter debate. I don't know if you keep up with Twitter debates, but there's been this little faction on Twitter that doesn't like certain pastors that they accuse of trying to be too winsome. They just want to appeal to the New York Times crowd and the Atlantic crowd, and so they'll never say anything that makes anybody uncomfortable, which is a complete misrepresentation. Wisdom is full of things we don't want to hear. If you deal in God's wisdom, at some point you'll be confronted with something you don't want to hear. I mean, if the Bible never contradicts us, then we're probably not reading it at face value. If we worship a God that never contradicts us, we're not worshiping the God of the Bible. Winsomeness works in you such that others see you're not trying to control them. You're willing to walk with them as you find them. That's a winsomely wise person. I'll walk with you as I find you, and I'll leave the control of your life to God. I want you to believe what I believe, but I'll leave control of your life. That's something you give to the Lord. A second question Barrett asked me to keep before us tonight was, what is God's wisdom, and how do we obtain it, and then how do we walk in it with courage? And so to answer that, let me kind of take a funnel approach, just to kind of start broadly and then move back down to Ecclesiastes. Broadly meaning the whole wisdom literature of the Bible. There are certain books in the Old Testament that are called wisdom literature. One of them is Proverbs. The wisdom literature of the Bible takes various angles on what wisdom is and its usefulness to us. And the angle that Proverbs takes is, as I said earlier, life isn't complicated, it is complex. But don't do foolish stuff. If you don't want bad consequences and difficult circumstances, you can avoid a lot of those things if you implement wisdom. Job is wisdom literature. Job has an angle. What wisdom has to do with suffering. Song of Solomon is wisdom literature. It has an angle on what wisdom is. What wisdom has to do with sex and why that's so appealing. And Ecclesiastes has its angle. And basically, the angle of Ecclesiastes is what wisdom has to do with boundaries and complexities. Boundaries having to do with limits. Complexities having to do with paradox. Paradoxes like, how can things be so fulfilling and so empty at the very same time? That's an Ecclesiastes matter. A lot of modern people know that particular intersection very well. How things can be so fulfilling and so empty at the same time. And so Ecclesiastes is a book that will resonate with a more secularized mindset. That is, a mindset that kind of looks at religion as, that's good for you, not necessarily something that I want. Though there's a professor at Belmont in Nashville named David Dark who wrote a book, Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. Basically, the premise of that book is everybody is religious. It may just be a religion of your own making. It just may be you remix religion and do it yourself. But a lot of moderns are post-truth in this way, as we would call them. They're non-religious. And they'll say, yes, things can be so fulfilling and so empty at the same time. That's my truth, too. They'll agree with us. They've lived it. But they will probably mishear the preacher of Ecclesiastes if they hear him being cynical. He's not cynical. You know, for instance, toward the end of the book, chapter 12 is where he says, chapter 12, verse 10, the preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. That's not cynical to do that. That's not a cynical person who's doing that. What he is he's actual. He's not a pessimist, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a realist. I would call him an actualist. That is, somebody who knows that what's actually true of life is that it doesn't always work well, even with wisdom. Wisdom won't insulate you from suffering. Wisdom is designed to make us actualists. What we find actually true of life, and a lot of our neighbors do as well, is that so much in life, vocationally and relationally and materially, can be fulfilling and empty at the same time. The nature of sin. What is sin? Writer from Britain named Francis Spufford calls sin the human propensity to muck things up, except he doesn't use the word muck. He's a British guy, so you can go with that as you will. But the nature of sin is to seek life in something other than God. St. Augustine had the classic, lived in the 400s, 500s. He spoke of sin as disordered love. It's love disordered. In other words, what Augustine said is that we love not just the wrong things, we love the right things the wrong ways. And this is our sinfulness. So sin is not just the evil things, it's also the good things we don't do. Biblically, sin is not just your unrighteousness, it's also your self-righteousness. Look at how Jesus interacted with self-righteous people. He called them to repent. He called them to believe. So the preacher explored this too. He explored sin, the nature of sin, this disorderedness of it. He explored what happens when we push past limits God imposes and go to loving the wrong things or loving the right things the wrong ways. And it was a controlled experiment. Chapter 2 gives us so much he burned through, but it was a controlled burn. And just to mention chapter 2, let's read a section of it. Let's read verses 1 through 11 in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. Again, I'm reading from the ESV. Chapter 2, verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks. You got into beauty. Planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. You got innovative. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. He owned people. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. And that's maybe the most famous passage in Ecclesiastes, other than the poetry on time. That's chapter 3, and eternity in our hearts, chapter 3, and chapter 12, the conclusion of the matter. But chapter 2, if you want the spark notes of Ecclesiastes, it's chapter 2. And what we've got here in chapter 2 is the preacher looking in all of the above that we just read, verses 1 through 11, for something to get him above the cycle of desire, use, repeat, which is where a lot of people are stuck in our infotainment complex age. I get desire, use, repeat from Leslie Jameson's memoir of addiction called The Recovering. And in it, Leslie Jameson says this, not a Christian, quote, "Addiction is always a story that has already been told because it inevitably repeats itself, because it grinds down ultimately for everyone to the same demolished and reductive and recycled core, desire, use, repeat." Now that fits chapter 2. Chapter 2 records desire, use, repeat, but it's not the desire, use, repeat of addiction. Though any of this, the preacher indulged, can become that. We can make anything an addiction or obsession or fixation. What the preacher is telling us about is a particular exploration that he gave himself to. In fact, note it that as he explored these boundaries, he says in verse 3, "My heart's still guiding me with wisdom." He says it again in verse 9, "Also my wisdom remained with me." If chapter 2 was him addicted or obsessed, he can't say that. So he explored, but within boundaries. He experimented, but it was a controlled experiment, like a controlled burn. To what end, though? To what end? Well, let's call it two ends. So much can be said from Ecclesiastes, but to try to hitch everything that's in its wagon to just two horses, just think of these two big Clydesdales pulling all the lessons of Ecclesiastes behind them. The wisdom experiment that Ecclesiastes is, exploring boundaries and complexities as this guy did, it's all in service to two great functions of wisdom. That's what I want to give you, these two tonight, and that's our time. Two functions of wisdom. One is to show us that so much that we ask to make us enough cannot bear the weight of that expectation. So much that we ask to make us enough cannot bear the weight of that expectation. That's a concern the preacher of Ecclesiastes had. And the other category that we'll operate in tonight, we'll just take these 1, 2. The second one will be, so many of the things we go seeking freedom and fulfillment from deliver far less than expected. All right, so we'll talk about so much we ask to make us enough cannot bear the weight of that expectation, and then we'll talk about so many of the things we go seeking freedom and fulfillment from deliver far less than we expect. So, first of these two overarching categories, so much we ask to make us enough cannot bear the weight of that expectation. If I asked you to give me kind of a survey of the room, what do you think, I think a lot, if we started to list kind of the modern maladies, what plagues people, our friends, our neighbors, people we share our work life with, etc., and so on. I think one of the things that we might land on is there's this haunting sense people have that I'm never going to be enough. My hostess last night stayed with some good friends, happened to mention during dinner, talking to her a little bit about this, and she goes, "Well, that's why I got off social media." She said it aggravated that sense of not enoughness. Every time I went on, somebody was boasting and bragging and showing me their perfection. And she said, I know it's not like that. I know it's not like that. And yet it just did it. It just kept working on me and working. I'm not enough. I'm not like her, My kids aren't doing as well as hers are. My kids aren't as pretty or photogenic as her kids are, We all get that. And so the preacher of Ecclesiastes got that way back in the ether of his ancient context, I mean, he understands that without Instagram. That there's something endemic to the human condition that we are too limited and we are too conflicted and we are too self-centered to ever be enough in ourselves. Plus, we're going to die. He always likes to add that. But don't despair, he's quick to say. There is one who can make us enough, and he gets to him in his final chapter, chapter 12. Just thinking about enoughness. You know the name Tennessee Williams? Famous playwright. If you studied theater or arts in college, you probably came across Tennessee Williams. 1947, he wrote an article for the New York Times provocatively titled "The Catastrophe of Success." And in it, he talks about how his success took him out of obscurity. Suddenly, he had a play that did really well, and suddenly he had in reach everything he ever wanted: notoriety, fame, wealth. Most people think that would be amazing. Celebrated everywhere he went. It doesn't appear from her new album Taylor Swift thinks it's so amazing anymore. But before her, Tennessee Williams found himself dissatisfied amid his dreams coming true. And the reason, he says, and a very key insight, is that when success comes, this is what he says in the article, when success comes, the struggle is over. The struggle is removed. The struggle is the very thing that made you hungry. Comfort is a liability. In the essay, he talks about getting to live in this first-class suite. This was the 1940s. And he's got room service, and everything's at his beck and call. He had arrived, but he had this sense of dislocation. And here's what he wrote in the essay, quote, "I got so sick of hearing people say, 'I loved your play,' that I could not say thank you anymore. I choked on the words and turned rudely away from the usually sincere person. I no longer felt any pride in the play itself, but began to dislike it, probably because I felt too lifeless inside to ever create another. I was walking around dead in my shoes, and I knew it." Tennessee Williams was having an Ecclesiastes experience. This preacher, he explored, it's been said tonight, everything. He explored satisfaction and isolation. He explored fulfillment, even despair. He says in verse 20 of chapter 2, verse 20, "I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun." This guy explored jadedness. He explored naivete. He looked at life and he looked at death, and he was both appalled and he was humored. He was intrigued by what could be achieved, but also disgusted at how our achievements can be forgotten or squandered just a generation later. It says that in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 2. Verse 18, I see that I've got to leave all that I toiled for to the man who comes after me, and who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool? Who knows whether he'll destroy it or make it better? I assume, and I think it's a warranted assumption, that each of us, we all recognize projects of self-making, searching for self-fulfillment through consumeristic or materialistic or individualistic means. We know that'll come up short. Money runs out. Even money God gives you runs out. Glamour runs out. I don't think beauty ever does, but there's a difference between glamour and beauty. Glamour runs out. Fun runs out. Fame runs out. Hair runs out. Life runs out eventually. You know how often the preacher speaks of chasing the wind or striving after wind, as it gets rendered. It's one of the through lines of Ecclesiastes, chasing the wind. All is vanity. The preacher says this over and over. But in saying it, he's not saying nothing matters. Not at all. You know, Ecclesiastes is mostly proverbial and poetic. It's these punchy observations and ideas. It's kind of strung together like garden lights, outdoor lighting. And the word vanity, it shows up some 30-odd times, depending on how you translate a few particulars. But over 30 times, you've got this word vanity. Some English renderings give it the rendering of meaningless. That's kind of a poor rendering, because meaningless gives us the sense nothing matters. He's saying nothing matters, but that's not what the word means. The very fact he's giving instruction means the preacher thinks his instruction matters. When he says something like over in chapter 4, verse 6, better is a handful of quietness than two handfuls full of toil and a striving after wind. That has to mean something. He's saying one action is better than another. Clearly, there's meaning implied. Over in chapter 12, when he says at the end of the letter or the book, the words of the wise, verse 11, are like goads and like nails firmly fixed to the collected sayings given by one shepherd. Apparently, the collected sayings, somebody collecting them, that matters. By vanity, as an emphasis, he means life is short. It's elusive. I remember the comedian Mario Joyner. Do you know that comedian? He has a great little line. He says when he hears people say, life is short, he likes to say back to them, man, life is the longest thing you will ever personally be involved in. You know, what are you talking about? Life is short. You know. And we get his meaning. But still, life is short in the sense that it can be taken from us in any moment. Life contains a lot of what feels like wind chasing. I mean, we will build $1 million developments and name them wind chase, you know? And it's where's the etymology? Chasing the wind, you know? But you'll pull into your prestigious, I live in wind chase. You know? So much that we ask to make us enough, it just can't bear the weight of that expectation. We're limited, we're conflicted, we're self-centered. And this is in the aggregate, not just in the individuals. And neither can the things we ask to make us enough insulate us from suffering. We won't talk about this tonight, but one of the rich values of Ecclesiastes is it says to us we have to have a meaning in life suffering cannot take away. Wisdom shapes us to see this, that so many of the things we ask to make us enough just can't bear the weight of that expectation. I mean, just again, looking at chapter 2 here, just let your eye fall down verses 1 through 8. So verse 1, he tries pleasure, comedy. He tried to become an alcohol connoisseur, even bottling his own vintage, verses 3 and 4. He tried owning people and being sex positive, verses 7 and 8. He tried money and investments, that's also verse 8. He tried throwing himself to work, that's the rest of the chapter. And found it all came up short. Not that any of it wasn't satisfying to a point. Don't miss that. It was satisfying. There's something satisfying about job well done. Stepping back from your work and saying, yes, it's good. I'm thankful. But he says at the end of the chapter, verses 24 to 26, receive the good things you have as gifts from God. And he repeats that throughout the pages of Ecclesiastes. What sin does is takes good things from God and makes them ultimate things. So when the preacher says, receive the good things you have as gifts from God, receive enjoyment itself as a gift from God, he also says enjoyment doesn't lead to fulfillment. Don't confuse enjoyment with fulfillment. Get God's perspective along with God's gifts. We're not made to shrink our lives down to the size of our enjoyments. Enjoyment does not equate to fulfillment. You know, every time the preacher says, this is vanity and a striving after the wind, we ought to hear that as a kind of groaning. It's a G.K. Chesterton insight. G.K. Chesterton lived 100 years ago. But he said, weariness in life doesn't come from too much pain, it comes from too much pleasure. The preacher loaded up on all these things in chapter 2 to see if they would make him enough, see if they would satisfy him, see if they would fill him full, maybe even keep him from suffering, prevent it. But it's like in filling up on these things, he's also sort of put himself under the weight of all these things, and he enjoys them to a point, but he also is groaning under their weight. And I get this word groaning purposefully from Romans 8 in the New Testament, where it says creation is groaning, awaiting the Lord's return, but also the Lord's people, we also groan ourselves because the full expression of God's kingdom has not yet come. It will at Jesus' return. That's Romans 8. Creation is groaning. God's people should groan too. I bet some of you know who Paul David Tripp is. One of his early books is called A Quest for More. Here's Paul David Tripp's words. We are supposed to groan because we are not yet all that God shed the blood of his Son for us to become. We are supposed to groan because the temporary pleasures of this physical world do not satisfy us. They always leave a void in our hearts. We are supposed to groan because in every situation and circumstances we see the damage that sin has done and is doing, even to the good things God gives us. We are supposed to groan because we recognize how we each give in to the temptation to seek in the physical world what we can only find in the Lord. Now, we're used to groaning in response to tragic or horrific things, but the preacher groaned amid the enjoyable things. And he tells us so in Ecclesiastes 2. Every time this preacher says it's vanity and a striving after wind or a chasing the wind, it's a kind of groaning, which is the sound of what? The sound of longing for something more and higher and greater than the greatest experiences that we can have with work and relationships and money and sex and power and everything the infotainment sphere wants to constantly preoccupy us with. Groaning is not finding fault with everything. It's not walking around like you were baptized in lemon juice or being a Debbie Downer about everything. That's not what groaning is. The preacher's groaning didn't make him a pessimist or a cynic or cause him to suicide ideate. The groaning is what turned him to God by the end of the book. Why? Because only God can bear the weight of making us enough. Only God can give us a meaning in life that suffering can't take away. We can't bear the weight of making ourselves ourselves. This is one of our great learning curves. In our sin, we ask persons, places, things, experiences, achievements to bear us up, to give us ultimate meaning. And so the preacher says, look, get God's perspective alongside God's gifts. We are not made to shrink our lives down to the size of our enjoyments. If I could just have this or that, if I could just achieve here, finally I would be enough. That becomes the little kingdom of the saturated self. Where wisdom takes us over and over again is our need for God to conquer us again, to recaptivate us by the beauty of the gospel, send us back to himself repeatedly. And the best way to glorify God is to enjoy him. Now, the second category of two, and we'll have time for questions. Wisdom shapes us to see how so many of the things we go seeking freedom and fulfillment from deliver far less than we expect. Maybe you noticed as you studied Ecclesiastes, all the striving this guy's exploration required. I mean, how exhausting. Doing, going. High achiever, this preacher. Ambitious, never satisfied. Nothing was ever enough. Self-fulfillment by way of self-making. He says he put that to the test. That's the very thing he tested. He tried it, and he found it was just never going to be true. I mean, it was true to a point, but it wasn't true. You know, the whole truth and nothing but. Ecclesiastes in summary. I did all this exploring for you. I examined everything that can be examined. I probed this, that, and the other. But I was never satisfied. My enjoyment wasn't fulfillment. Plus, I knew I'd die. There's that again. See, I noticed as I went through Ecclesiastes, there was always next for him. The next building project, the next vintage to bottle, the next subject to master, the next million to bank, the next partner to bed, the next comedian to discover. Desire, use, repeat, on endless loop, insatiable appetite, but never fulfilled. Never enough, never finished, never complete. Never stop exploring. He was there before the North Face got there. So maybe fulfillment, the fulfillment we're looking for, maybe it isn't found so much in striving and exploring. Maybe it's found in standing in something that is finished and holds out to me a deeper satisfaction than what I can accomplish on my own. Because anything and everything I can accomplish on my own can be taken from me. And sometimes, maybe most times, at no fault to myself. Death will take it, if not something before. Maybe the fulfillment we're looking for is found in something that's been done so completely and so well, I can't add anything to it except my receptivity, just my receiving it. I think this is where he's going when in chapter 12 he says, fear God. The end of the matter, this is chapter 12, verse 13, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. To fear God is to stand in awe of him. To not allow myself to be wholly defined by anything other than God's grace and goodness. To fear the Lord is to take him seriously. So seriously that I don't locate my fulfillment, my highest good, or my deepest joy in something less than him. Where do I get this? Where do I get contentment and fulfillment that transcends the immediate? That's more and better than whatever's happening now. Where can I go where I'm no longer driven to exhaust myself in 1,000 pursuits for meaning and enoughness? Or go looking inside myself. That's another route people take, is we go looking inside ourselves for validation and affirmation that we need. You know, the preacher of Ecclesiastes says to go that route, trying to find validation and affirmation through life on our own terms, that's the ultimate fool's errand. You're not big enough for you. Have something bigger. You know, there's nothing so empty as experiencing that which you thought would be the ultimate, and it let you down. It left something out. I mean, you got into the great school, and you got the degree. You got the car everyone says wow over. You got the husband or the wife that others wish they had. You got the athletic kid. You know how much glory you will have in the stands of high school stadiums? Refracted glory from your kid. My 9th grader got to start on the varsity at his high school in Nashville, which was a mistake. He got concussed in the first game. He went up against a signee at Tennessee, a 6'5", 270 kid. So that ended at Vanderbilt Hospital that night. But you just walk into the stadium and it's like, hey, his freshman is starting. It's like, okay, he's our 5th of 5. He's the baby. We're kind of over it by now. We've been there and done that. You get money. You get the house in the neighborhood that's better than heaven. I got to stay in one of those neighborhoods. Last night, my friends lived there, and it's a very Tony Memphis address. And they said, the thing we discovered about our neighborhood, I was asking them who the famous people that live there, and they were telling me, I'm not going to tell you the names. And she said, one of our neighbors calls this neighborhood Beautiful Darkness. She said it's the place everybody wants to live, and all these rich and famous people in Memphis live there. And she said, I can walk you down the street and point out, I heard them arguing in their backyard, screaming at each other the other night. I know this guy is a hoarder. His mansion is full of crap, And it's beautiful darkness. We can lose any of all of that. Or you can get there and just go, really? These are my neighbors in this neighborhood? What then? You and I, as image bearers of God, were made for something more. And the timeless gift that the preacher of Ecclesiastes gave us in this book is he signaled to us, to every generation, in every era, and it speaks really well, Ecclesiastes does, in secularized contexts especially. It's what Augustine would later say, that our hearts are restless until we find rest in him. God gives me things to enjoy, but not to find fulfillment in. God gives me himself to enjoy and find fulfillment in. It's both and with that. He gives us himself to both enjoy and find fulfillment in. How? Fulfillment comes in receiving what God has finished on my behalf. We're at the end here. Look at chapter 12, verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. And Creator is capitalized. I mean, he's basically saying start on your deathbed. Start on your deathbed. Look out over life and see how it's supposed to be lived. And Creator is capitalized there. And then you get a capitalization of shepherd in 10 verses later in verse 11 of chapter 12. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They're given by one shepherd, capitalized. The preacher had an inkling that something was coming after him, maybe a truer and better preacher who might even finish this wisdom experiment and exploration he started. And we know one truer and better preacher did. His name was Jesus. If I want fulfillment, I should link my life to the finished work of the Creator shepherd who used nails firmly fixed. What an image. Literally, to defeat death and remove the fear of it from me. Death comes because we don't keep the commandments. We don't fear God. That's why death comes. But Jesus kept the commandments flawlessly so that in His life, I get a life with God. He makes me presentable to God. Fulfillment comes in standing in what is finished, what has been done so completely well. And what Jesus finished for me, it first reveals to me how lost I am, that I would actually go looking, thinking that money and sex and knowledge and acclaim and success and comfort will give me ultimate meaning, that I actually think that is something I have to be redeemed from. So many who've gone before us, and so many around us now, show us it doesn't. No, it's me. Hi. I'm the problem. It's me. Money delivers. Money does deliver. Sex delivers. Power delivers. Success delivers to a point. Money can buy you some measure of happiness and some measure of fulfillment, but it cannot buy you sustaining grace. It cannot buy you the delivering goodness of the finished work of Jesus on my behalf that makes me an insider with God, the life of God available to me in such a way that no thing and no one, not even death, can remove that which He gives me by way of Jesus. Nothing can defeat everything God has promised to be for me in Jesus. Now, the preacher didn't know that. He lived that side of the cross. But he had an inkling that something was coming. See, I love that we can see Jesus even from Ecclesiastes. Because what Ecclesiastes tells us all the way through is the very stuff Jesus preached. Jesus said the abundance of life, the fullness of life, fulfilling life is not and has never been about possessions or experiences, but being possessed by our Creator who is also our shepherd, owning His ownership of us. Jesus preached that. So did the preacher of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says what Jesus Himself said, that you find your life by actually giving it away. Not by engaging in so many projects of self-making, the search to find something that will finally make me enough. Jesus says, I'll make you enough. More than enough. Ecclesiastes says what Jesus Himself said, that if you go to Him, you'll find rest. Not the exhaustive search to death for what matters, but a death that actually searches us, calls us out to a greater love, a greater gain. Not the waste of a perfect life, but the service of that life as our substitute, so that the unworthy get counted worthy to get in on everything that God has promised to be for us in Jesus. Jesus is the truer and greater preacher of Ecclesiastes. Now, we've got time for questions. I landed the plane right at the moment it was supposed to be in. I could have been a pilot if I wasn't a preacher. So I was told that there might be some questions, Mitchell, that if people wanted to ask. I know you can sometimes be shy about asking before the group, but this is your church, so don't be shy. Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Um,
And it can be anything. Anything about Ecclesiastes. We kind of looked at 2 and 12 and not a lot in the middle. But
thank you so
anything
much.
you
I
want.
think
Yeah.
I speak for all of us, and I'm sure you'll hear this afterwards, but we're really grateful for you and opportunity to hear God's wisdom through you. So guys, John mentioned this at the very beginning. You can text, like right now as we're talking, you can text into our number 97,000. You can text a question. I'll get it on my phone, and I'll decide if it's worth asking, okay? But you can also raise your hand if you're brave. What we know is that sometimes that's hard, okay? So you can ask an anonymous question over text to whatever works for you. We've got, hey, Mary Kay has one already.
Yeah.
And the Creator, us groaning, and then it talks about the Spirit groaning.
Yeah.
So how is that connected? Because that's something that's always intrigued me.
Spirit groaning with interceding for us, that passage in Romans 8. I think it's one of the most beautiful places, one of the most beautiful promises, really. I mean, it's beautiful. At first, we just need to admire the beauty of it, that God cares for us in such a way that, and I think, depending on the kinds of troubles you know in your life, you may know the kinds of troubles that your groaning is a laid out on the floor, crying out to God kind of groaning. I take it that, and all of Romans 8, in the whole context of that chapter, is how much God cares for us, that we are loved with a love that raises the dead. And that the Spirit groaning for us, interceding for us with groanings too deep for words, is that God knows us so completely that if I'm inarticulate and I don't know what to say, I can just say, you know what I'm feeling, you know what I'm thinking. And the confidence we have is that He knows how to take that and bring from it what we need. It may take a long time, it may struggle. Yeah.
But understanding our limits and groaning with us in that,
Yeah.
but seeking the deeper level.
Yeah. I'll quote John Calvin, who says he was talking about the condescension of God, how it's not condescending. It doesn't it doesn't make us feel, oh, He sort of put me in my place. It's condescension. It's a greater to a lesser. But Calvin talked about how God lisps to us like a nursemaid with a baby. And you think about, and I was just with my little 8-month-old grandson, and my talking changes when I'm holding Tommy. Because of what he can comprehend and understand. He knows Pops loves him, somehow. He brightens when he sees me. And I'm recognizable to him. I mean, little babies are looking for faces that are recognizable to them. And I think somehow Romans 8 is getting at that dynamic, that God's kindness and goodness to us manifests in that way, that even in our inarticulateness of how do I express my being to God, He already knows. And Jesus talked about that. You don't have to heap up all the phrases. Your Father knows what you need. And so prayer really should become more of a dialogue and a conversation than, just this list of things I need or need Him to do,
That's great. We do have one. I'll kind of get the ball rolling with too, and it's a little more personal, Cole. We'd love to hear from you about this. So as you look out, you said you're used to looking at young faces. The median age in this room is pretty low.
Yeah.
If we take out a few of you, it's you're busting the curve, a few of you, but mid-20s. And so we're curious if you could go back in time, how would you express God's wisdom to your mid-20s, let's say 25-year-old self?
I've actually given some thought to this. I would tell him, do not be surprised by the suffering that is coming into your life, And that does not mean that God has shelved you or that God doesn't care about you. There are purposes God has that you don't understand and you never will. I had lunch with a dear friend here in Memphis Tuesday who has been through the rottenest of years. Lost his son. His son had been addicted, had a relapse, died. He's been through some other things. You know, we talk about courageous living. I mean, that guy getting out of bed every day is courageous. And we were talking about, I have a son in addiction, going on 7 years now. And so he and I became friends through mutual sons, but he's lost his son now. And we were talking about just, that wasn't on the script of life. When I was 25, I'd been married a year and became a father at 27. And so I was serving a church in Franklin, Tennessee. But before we came to Memphis, for the last 18 years, we were in Nashville, so we kind of went home. And that's what I would tell my 25-year-old self, you know. Some things are coming that you don't want. God's not going to prevent them. And don't, when you get there, forget all the stuff you've learned. And now suddenly go, hey, what gives? You know, you're supposed to give me this life that was free of all this stuff I don't want. The don't want is an invitation to a higher dialogue in some way, shape, form, or fashion. I don't understand it and I don't like it. But it's something comes out of it that's fruitful and good. And you know, what my friend and I were talking about Tuesday in Salsa restaurant, the places you have these great conversations. Just do the next faithful thing. Just do the next faithful thing. And, you know, sometimes it feels like it takes a Herculean effort to do that. But we have seen the goodness of God through the troubles. And you don't see that if you don't keep going. You know, if you belly up and quit and say, this is not what I asked for, you don't see it. Yeah.
It's incredible. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody got one? I have more on the phone, but I want to give opportunity if anybody's brave. So I think a good follow-up to that was along those lines, as you pastor people, specifically young people, if you can, what are the ways that you see a need for God's perspective? So what are the ways you see young people, you know, wind chasing or having those Ecclesiastes moments where they come up empty and need God's perspective? Are there things that come to mind there for a church like ours?
Oh, well, I love the energy in young churches like mine and yours. That's been really refreshing, and it's been a reset for my wife and me to come into a young congregation. They really honored me because I didn't fit the median age of that congregation. My oldest elder is 37.
I didn't mean you, by the way, earlier. I was talking about not you.
That's fine. But, you know, I think you've got a lot ahead of you still. You don't know what's around the bend. Position yourself that whatever is there, you want to stay true. You want to stay with the Lord. You know, historically, all through church history, I mean, when people suffered, they went toward God. We got to the late 20th century, and I think just kind of the way we live and the expectations of life that we have and the sense of control that we have, and we start to suffer, and then we start backing away from God. And a lot of our Americanism is tied up in that, and kind of our sense that if you just go to this school and you live in this neighborhood and you run with these people, everything's going to work out fine. You're going to like your life. And, you know, for the most part, it usually follows that script, but it'll have some bends and turns and twists that you're not expecting. And so use youth. Don't waste it. Use it in the direction of... I told a college campus pastor friend one year, and I probably sound very dour talking like this, But he asked me, what's the one thing I need to give college students? He's at the University of Oklahoma. And I said, I think you need to teach them how to suffer. Because they're going to, at some point in their life, it can't come as a shock. The thing itself will shock you. Oh my gosh, we're dealing with this. But the reality of it can't shock you. We can't act like, whoa, wait a minute, how did this sneak in to my life? Because none of us have been promised that we're going to avoid the things, all the things that we may want to avoid. And I'm sure some of you have already gone through hard things in life. It's not like you get to some magic age and then the suffering starts. I don't want to give you that impression. Some of you have been through things, you're going through things now. Try to really set your roots. One of the things we're doing in our church is we're doing some spiritual formation, which are about practices, not about so much knowledge to gain, but practices. And those practices, it's like learning a sport or a skill or an instrument. It's muscle memory. And so we actually started with generosity. And we're talking about that in a young church in a terrible economy. But the New Testament structure of giving it's an act of grace. It's nothing you're compelled to do. It's something we're instructed to do but not compelled to do. So we walk in that tension. And if you can get that practice going when you're young, then when you get tested financially with either plenty or want, you find that the practice is still there. It's not being affected by the circumstance. And so I think we're all probably way too circumstantial. We just, we're like a pinball machine, a little ball banging around, and we're trying to keep it in the field of play. And I think the other thing I would say to younger people is, in your devotion to Christ, if you get really serious about the Lord, would that we all be serious about the Lord, also be kind to yourself. You're still going to fail. You're still going to blow it. The closer something gets to light, the more defined are its shadows. I learned that at the Children's Museum, of Memphis. Don't be surprised as you get closer to Jesus that you see more muck and gunk and junk in yourself. You'll know if your love for Jesus is growing, but you'll also see yourself in ways you're like, man, I thought I'd have beat this by now, or I thought I'd have a different thinking pattern. And you will, and you do. The very fact that you're having that dialogue with yourself means that you do. But just being gracious and kind to yourself. Andrew Peterson has a song called "Be Kind to Yourself." It's a wonderful little song. I think he wrote it for one of his kids. It was engaging in some self-loathing. Neither self-loathing nor self-aggrandizing is gospel fruit. And I tend toward more the self-loathing side of the spectrum. And so I've had to learn that is, I can't do that. So those are a few thoughts.
Oh, that's great. I think, so I think we have time for one more. I don't know if you'd be willing to kind of hang around after we finish, if there's anyone who wants to come.
I just have to drive to Nashville.
He is driving all the way back to Nashville tonight. He said he's got to get him a Mountain Dew to make it home. But I think just to kind of wrap up would be,
I've made the drive late at night. It's totally fine. I've done it many times.
Yeah. We'll still pray for you.
It's okay.
And I hope this isn't intended to be a layup question. I hope it's not too obvious. We do want to hear from you personally. How do you practically keep yourself really rooted and grounded in God's perspective in the gospel, as you spoke to at the end of your teaching? How do you do that practically?
Lately, it's been praying the Psalms. Yeah, I live in the Psalms because every emotion is expressed in the Psalms. And I know that sounds like a quick answer, but I have been thinking about this too. And if not for the Psalms, man, they have just become so much more valuable to me. And so I just stay in the Psalms. And I find, as a middle-aged guy with a reset in my career right now, very different church than the church I served here, that the Psalms just about every time I open a psalm and read, I just feel like I'm met there. It's no flash of light or brilliant insight. It's just like that phrase or that word or that verse or that whole passage. I need that, you know. And so that's been keeping me true. And there's a phrase called "out of true." I learned it just this year. I took my mountain bike to a shop, and the technician said, "Your bike's out of true." And I always love phrases. What'd you say? Out of true. And he goes, "Yeah, your front tire is just a little bit off." And I couldn't tell, but he said, I can fix it later. He said, I can't fix it today. It's an appointment kind of thing. But I kept thinking about out of true. I don't want to be out of true. The Psalms keep me in true, I think. Keep me in tune to more musically analogy it to the Psalms.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's so practical.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you again for watching this Bible teaching from Island Community Church. We want to encourage you to join us in person for worship soon. For more information about our worship gatherings, gospel resources, and ways to connect with ICC, you can visit us at iccmemphis.com or download our Island Community Church app. As we close, we offer a prayer blessing for you from Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you may abound in hope.